pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and happy Pride. I am here with a blast from all of our past, certainly my past. This is Dan from the Weird Book Club. Hello, Dan.
Hi, Shawn.
It's been a while.
Having me on. Yeah, it has. Happy Pride Month to you.
Happy Pride. We're going to talk about some queer lit and a bunch of queer things. Why don't we start with my nostalgic feelings, my pinings for the Weird Book Club. What's up with your channel?
Currently, we are on an indefinite hiatus, which is not to say that there might. I mean, obviously, we're just setting up the glorious resurgence at a later date. You know, we've got to build up that anticipation.
Well, I'm hoping this conversation will create some momentum in that regard.
I think that when I have a book or a series of books that I have enough to say about and an objective in mind with what I would want to achieve in creating videos again, then I could see myself returning to the format. Right now, I'm having fun talking to my friends, such as yourself, about the books that I'm reading in a non-public forum, and that's sufficiently gratifying. And but you know, eventually, when all of my copious free time returns and I have the mental bandwidth and such, yeah, it could happen. It could happen.
Well, in the meantime, you're welcome to come on my channel and talk about what you've been reading or any old topic, any old time. So you have dressed for the occasion, or should I say undressed?
Yes, I'm trying to embody the spirit of Pride 2021, or at least in the way that it's discussed on twitter.com. I'm not sure. Other people probably have other experiences if you're not wasting a good part of your day on Twitter. But yeah, I just got this as my new muscle tank from Sublunary Editions, the publisher Sublunary Editions. It says, after a few pages, you are obfuscated by the literary debauch. And since we're engaging in some literary debauch today, I thought that would be appropriate. And then, the other side of Pride discourse, aside from being scandalized, is, obviously the provocation. It's a man. You can see my legs. So I got my cute little shorts that I might wear to some festive occasion in the future. When there is cause to do so.
I didn't actually notice the shorts, but anyway, I guess there were some shorts there. Oh my goodness. Fabulous. And I think that we could probably use the little caption on that cartoon there as a segue into what we're going to start the conversation talking about, and that is a queer novella, Pete's Underpants by Bertie Marshall, which was published, when was it published? 2019. By a small press from the UK. I'm pretty sure it's the UK. Dostoevsky Wannabe. And I found out about this somehow. And I suggested to Dan that we do some kind of collaboration on it. So it's all my fault. And so now we have both, I'll put the book down and put the GIF up, but now we have both read it and we are going to chat about it. So I guess I will start by saying that you talked me out of bailing last night.
Are you upset at me now that you finished it?
No, I'm glad you did, and I don't want people to have a field day with the fact that I'm grateful that I didn't bail, because bailing is still the best option. But I was in the middle of it. It's 107 pages. I think it was on page 66, and it was in the middle of an extended dream sequence, like where he was writing about dreams, and that's just puts me to sleep faster than anything. Reading about dreams in literature. So that's why but that didn't last many more pages, and then it was back to what so I'm glad I finished it, and so thank you for restraining my urges in that regard.
I'm here to help, Shawn. Though I'm generally not in favor of restrained urges.
I'm glad I didn't fail, and I'm gonna turn it over to you. Why don't you start?
Sure. Well, I guess I was curious. You've already addressed this, but how you might have stumbled across this book recommendation in the first place. It comes sort of in this mysterious, this is the entire back of the book, is this sort of washed out author photo. And I guess Bertie Marshall, I tried to do some minimal, I won't even call it research, some light Googling to to kind of, because he sort of addresses his own backstory slightly. I mean, he's written other books, some of them I guess more biographical. I don't sure, is this considered a novel? It has it reads as auto fiction, maybe, if that's I'm not sure that's a meaningful.
That sounds about right to me. Yeah, it reads as very autobiographical fiction, definitely, or something that was attempting to be fiction.
Right. I mean, it's formally quite loose, and I think it plays around with various different styles, like you were describing that extended dream sequence. And I guess that was the most interesting thing about the book to me, is how it kept shape-shifting a little bit. And maybe my lack of a specific idea of what the book would be helped in that regard. I wasn't so bound to a particular expectation of subject matter. I mean, aside from the fact that, I mean, Pete's underpants were mentioned, and they have a substantial role in the book, I guess, as substantial as any other character. And but his relationship with Pete, it's not fleshed out in maybe a more typical literary format. It's sort of a lot of the times sort of poking around the edges, and I don't know, maybe I'm just sort of obtuse, and you caught this in your sharper, more focused reading, Shawn. But what became of Pete? Yeah, there's this. Pete becomes this figure, especially in the latter half of the book, where almost like the symbol of loss of the narrator, author, however similar those two entities are supposed to be. But it remains quite ambiguous what happened to Pete. It seems that he's probably passed away. I think he says that a few times, but how or...
Yeah, I believe that he had died. There's quite a few references to the year of his death. And I think there was one reference to the fact that it was of natural causes. So it wasn't like suicide and I don't think it was HIV related. It just seemed like his heart stopped. Like he was young. And to the degree that we can believe anything the narrator says, because the narrator is so strung out on pills but I think I chose to believe that Pete died quite young. Maybe he was 20 when they met, I think, and that maybe he died in his mid 30s, just of natural causes. He just kind of dropped dead. And that would make sense. Close to the present of this narrative, like in around 2017 or something.
Right. Because there are so many of these sequences, like the dream sequence, and other times where it's not clear if the narrator is actually recounting lived events, or there's just sort of conjecturing on what might have happened when when he and Pete fell out of touch. I mean, like you said, the author or the narrator kind of lives in this almost like a fantasy world of sorts, where they're, highly dependent on opiates to get through any given day. They're, putting on all of these sort of like classic art movies in the background, and those they almost become like the background music of the narrative. Like he's sort of describing the storylines of these films, or some occasionally other books as well, and then sort of imposing the events of that plot on his recollections about Pete, and maybe sort of more generally this idea of how these people who somehow mean a lot to you, and yet you aren't able to sustain a close or as close of a connection as you would like.
And I want to say, and just jumping off what you've just said, Dan, that for me, it was the digressions, especially about movies and celebrities and even literature. I loved the extended passage about Stephen Crane, for example, and we can maybe get into that in a few minutes, but they were much more vivid than anything that he described about his relationship with Pete.
Right.
So Bertie Marshall can write. And whether we call the narrator Bertie Marshall or not, but the first person narrator of this story is very intelligent and perceptive and articulate, but not about this relationship with Pete. I never got a sense of who Pete was to him, other than I would say the opening scene with the Underpants, the first night they spent together. And then the references thereafter become more and more kind of abstract, and I just never really could understand, or for me as a reader, I could never feel what was the meaning of this. I did believe that the narrator missed him, didn't really know how to stay connected with him, did his best through all of his sleeping pill induced haze to keep in contact with this new thing called email. But I never really could feel what he meant to him or what he was like as a person. So.
Yeah, it remains this sort of, he's almost like this mostly blank screen onto which the narrator sort of projects their various trains of thought. And I think the diversity of those sort of digressions, I mean, you can't really call them digressions if they're sort of the main substance of the book, right. I guess, but that's they feel digressive. It almost seemed to become sort of the point. And also there's this running theme of the narrator who is writing this book, Pete's Underpants, Bertie Marshall perhaps, is trying to decide what the book is about as they're writing it, and also this desire not to come to a conclusion at the end, because he sort of sets himself an arbitrary deadline, which I think is tied to maybe the anniversary of Pete's death, for when he wants to finish the book. So yeah, there's that sort of tension, the classic tension between sort of wanting to keep things open and infinite possibilities, but then also this need to kind of have closure, maybe move out of some of these self-destructive cycles he's built up for himself through his past experiences, because the novel is kind of separated into two time periods. One where he's sort of about my age, mid to late 30s, and Pete is a hot young thing in New York. As I was reading the book, this is where the book kind of won me over, because as it got closer into the end, I was like, oh, this is really just a book about like an aging gay man who gets sad a lot. And I'm like, that's really relatable, Bertie. I can feel that.
Shut up. Shut up. No, I agree with you. I think that mood and that, can we call it a narrative? I think it was well done. He's a really good writer. And the were excellent, and the way that the novel kind of came to a close or didn't come to a close, a lot of that really worked for me.
Mm-hmm.
But what bugged me, there were a lot of typographical errors or punctuation errors. So I don't know whether to blame the author. Certainly I blame the publishing house for not catching them. Like, they were missing words once or twice, but certainly a lot of just weird, like, we don't have to dwell on them. We don't have to go through them all. But the first one I noticed was on a few lines, maybe the third sentence. One such story, the protagonist, me, being buggered by a French-Korean stud over Samuel Beckett's gravestone. I mean, the sentence gets my attention, but the hyphen between French-Korean is one of those long hyphens with a space before and after it. Like, French-Korean should just have a little hyphen and no space. And I mean, am I being too anal? Or but like, that's so sloppy. And there was maybe, what would you say, a dozen in a 107-page book. There was maybe a dozen things like that.
Mm-hmm.
More than that, I think the writing is, I would say, for the most part, very good and at times excellent. There was something about the content of this that in places where he was kind of making observations on the writing process, where he just point blank admitted that he was being slapdash and kind of lazy about it. And that really bugged me, because I did feel that if he put a little bit more, to the degree that his, pill popping haze would permit, if he put a little bit more effort into it, there's a lot of really interesting stuff here. And so my feeling is negative but mixed because of those negative things.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely found those typographical errors and grammatical stuff distracting at the outset. And maybe I just stopped paying as close attention as I got further along in the book, but they did seem to be concentrated more towards the beginning. So that is definitely like, if those things bug you, and you're going to encounter a lot of them like right off the bat. And so that could easily sort of derail you a bit.
The only one that near the end was at the bottom of page 105. I hate that question. Oh, and the question was, is everything to your satisfaction? And then, I hate that question. I have no idea what it means. I'm never satisfied. And that's one my crosses to bear. I don't think there's any dialect or any regional or type of English where that would be correct. It must be one of my crosses to bear. Is it just because I'm a ESL teacher that it bugs me? But it's like, it was a pretty darn interesting sentence, but so
right.
But I agree with you. Most of them were at the beginning.
Yeah, and especially when you're invoking like you could be mean and call it a cliche, but it's a common turn of phrase, which always includes that one word that's not in that in that presentation there.
Just that kind of sloppiness drives me crazy. But
there
were a lot of things in it that I thought were really fascinating. I loved the little anecdote about Patti Smith being Pete's mother's next door neighbor or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And the Stephen Crane thing was probably my favorite part. And it didn't seem to be connected to Pete, other than that Stephen Crane died young.
Mm-hmm.
Pete died young, but Bertie Marshall, or whoever the narrator is browsing in a bookstore, and I Googled it. Yes, it is a real bookstore in New York City. And he finds a book that kind of is like a queer reading of Stephen Crane's life, which I think is a bit of a stretch. I haven't read the book. Do you know anything about that?
I don't really know much about Stephen Crane's biography, but one thing, and this is kind of tying into what you're talking about here, a lot of the references he made were like weirdly relevant. I mean, this guy he self-presents as quite free associative.
Yep.
And so that, like, when you actually recognize some of the things that he's talking about, or this is kind of the experience for me, is like, oh, hey, we do kind of have that in common a little bit. And I haven't read it in a long time, but Stephen Crane was randomly, I think the first book of poetry I ever got was his like collected poems, and a lot of them, if I'm remembering correctly, kind of, they're a little bit shorter. They have some of them have this kind of like parable like quality to them, where it tells a little story and kind of leaves you thinking. But I don't think he's certainly not like highly critically lauded in today's elite poetry circles, if such things exist. Then you don't hear Stephen Crane as much anymore. But I remember it was a very specific reference point.
Yeah, I remember when the biography came out. I won't take the time to look for the title, but I'll put the GIF for this biography. It came out, I think, in the late 80s or early 90s, just around the time that queer studies was starting to emerge as a big thing in academia. And it was some kind of a queer reading of Stephen Crane's life, which I think is a bit of a stretch, but I haven't read the book. Well, this is editing Shawn, and I was completely out to lunch. The biography does not assert anything about sexuality, Stephen Crane being gay, nothing like that. I was completely off the mark. It does happen only about once every 5 years. And Bertie Marshall doesn't talk about the details of it, but he buys the book in the bookstore, and then he pretty much impulsively calls a cab and goes out to, is it New Jersey? Anyway, it's a fairly long cab ride to pay his respects to Stephen Crane's grave. And it seems to be a displaced kind of thing that he never did anything like that for Pete. But it was just really well written and interesting, almost like a set piece. And it was impressive. And I wouldn't have read it if you hadn't talked me out of bailing last night. So
see, look at this powerful synergy that we're building, Shawn. I honestly, if you had asked me that question when I was midway through the book, I would probably have just said, feel free to just skip the rest. I started to view even the beginning parts, which were more so for me, even now in retrospect, but like viewing them in relation to the end pieces, kind of, I don't know, there's like a little bit more grace that I'm willing to give looking back towards the beginning of the book, which is kind of weird to think about since it's not that long to begin with, that you would have like a very different view of it by the end. But that was my experience for sure.
It has not many reviews or ratings on Goodreads, but it's at a 3, and I would probably give it, most generously, I would give it a 3 because of the things I didn't like. But if it continues to stick with me, no, I couldn't give it more than a 3, I don't think. But it had some really interesting parts. So would you recommend it?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I would say how would I recommend this book? I guess I would recommend it to like other sad gay people who like the movies or
not only this sad gay person here, but other sad gay people.
we all feel sad sometimes, Shawn. Some of us just do it more beautifully than others. You're the beautiful summer child who innocently recommended this somewhat depressive book. So it's not really, if you're looking for like a Pride Month read to like feel, optimistic about queer life and, imagining a positive future, then this is not really going to give it to you. But if you want to listen to a guy who has some pretty interesting thoughts on like art, film, and, a few more obscure authors, and has depressive episodes in a way that I find relatable, then this would be the book for you. Is that a good pitch, Shawn? Did I sell it?
That sounds very accurate. I would say just maybe my last comment on this 107-page novella is, I think it captures a certain persona, a certain queer type, a gay man who has fairly low emotional intelligence or emotional articulateness and is totally fucked up with addiction and his own self-image, but is just has a mastery over talking about film and literature. Also is really has quite a stunning perspective on life. So, that's not I don't want to talk about it as a stereotype, but there is a certain kind of gay man out there, and this really captures that, I think. Do you have any last thoughts? I'd like to move on to other queer books, but do you have any last thoughts on Pete's Underpants?
Pete, wherever you are, we miss you.
Good final word. So you brought a bunch of gay books?
I brought some gay books and some of the books that he mentioned in this book, such as I wanted to touch on briefly, because this author has the honor of receiving Shawn's, in some year, worst book that he read that year. I can't recall quite what the name for that distinction is in your
something like that.
Year.
Yeah.
Yeah, so César Aira, he talks about this specific novella, The Miracle Cures of Dr. Aira. And I'm a fan of César Aira, but he also has this sort of like slapdash quality to his writing, where the commonly cited thing about his writing style is that he tries to end each section by kind of writing himself into an impossible plot situation, and then the next chapter is always him trying to like write himself out of it and then back into another weird situation,
Is
which
he a gay writer?
he's not, to my knowledge. I don't believe so.
I think that the themes like that show up. But anyway, the way you've described his fiction sounds like my love life in the 90s.
Writing yourself into an impossible situation and finding your way
myself
out.
Right out.
The Sean Mooney origin story. I love it. But I mean, in terms of like writing style, like you can see some similarities. And it was just interesting to me because he was talking about this scenario. And I was like, hey, that sounds like that book by César Aira. And then he like specifically mentions the book. I'm like, all right, we have something in common, Bertie Marshall. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but I color me intrigued, and I will do some introspection after I complete this reading experience. But the other authors that he brings up as sort of like stylistic reference points, Bertie Marshall does. He talks about William Burroughs, which actually I'm kind of a poser for holding this up because I've only ever started a William Burroughs book a few times and I've never finished one. He's kind of one of those authors that they're famous for being experimental and difficult and transgressive, and whether or not you have the patience for that on any given day.
Transgressive, difficult, and unreadable. I did read Naked Lunch, but I have all I remember is the trauma of this experience. Yeah, no.
It sticks with you. And then he mentions Kathy Acker also as a reference point. And I read this book as a buddy read with Britta a while back. And she's definitely a queer, or was a queer author, and someone who had sort of a artistic or like art scene persona outside of her writing, as far as my understanding is. And there's sort of a parallel there between her and Bertie Marshall, I guess you would say, because, from my light Googling I did, he seemed to be part of some kind of like punk or artsy scene in London at some point. And I think some of his previous biographical writing gets into that in more detail, but you get the impression that they share this idea of like a writer who you would pick up not just to engage with the story within the text itself, but because they have this sort of like known persona out there in the world, and you're trying to get I don't know, the author is almost a character in their own writing kind of thing.
Have you read Crudo by Olivia Laing?
I have not. Have you?
I don't recommend it. I bailed on page 6, I think. But one of the conceits of the narrative is that it's really autofiction, but Olivia Laing is kind of using Kathy Acker's name, if not her persona, but it's really her. Every time I talk about this novel, which I didn't get past page 6, I read my Goodreads review. I'm not going to do that here. I will just put a link in the show notes if you want to read it, because I satirize that her writing style. So I'm not interested in Kathy Acker, and I have not heard anything about her writing that makes me think that I want to read it.
I don't think I could give you a compelling case, Sean. I mean,
remember we talked about it when you.
Yeah, I think she's interesting. It's kind of like these things. It's the inverse of Pete's Underpants, where like Pete's Underpants, I had no idea who Bertie Marshall was, no idea what the book was about. And I feel like Kathy Acker, especially today, if you're interested in picking up one of her books, you almost encounter like her image and the legends of her legacy before you ever actually like read a word of her writing. So,
but I don't want to think too long or too literally about the inverse of Pete's Underpants.
What about you, Sean? Were there any queer books or books that you liked better than Pete's Underpants that this experience sort of brought to mind?
Well, you know what? I noted the reference. And did you mention Gertrude Stein before or after we started our official chat that's being recorded?
I think it was before,
Okay,
yeah.
so before we started the chat, you mentioned Gertrude Stein. So he references composition as explanation. So I looked that up, and it's an essay, and I haven't read it, but I'm interested in Gertrude Stein's writing. I haven't read very little of it, but the older I get, the more accessible it feels. So I've read a few I read a few sentences of it. It's on the internet for free. This essay, Composition as Explanation. So that interests me. That I made a note of that. Let's see. I didn't do a lot of underlining. I want to read. I've never read The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane, which I don't think is a queer text. No, it was actually more movies that I kind of looked up, and I watched previews of them and stuff. And he encounters Taylor Mead, who was an actor, writer, and Warhol superstar. In this novella, he comes off as a real bitter old queen. But when I Googled him, in 1965, Andy Warhol made a movie with him, and the title of the movie tells you everything you need to know, apparently, about the movie. The title is Taylor Mead's Ass, and it's, I don't know how many minutes, it's 30 minutes at least, just close-up shot of his bare buttocks. So
I approve.
Yes. The next page, page 21. This is about Taylor Mead as Bertie Marshall encounters him when he's about 70 or 80 or something in the New York City bar. Taylor paused and gazed off into some reverie. In that gaze, comma, I could almost smell, comma, semen, comma, old makeup, comma, glitter, and bad breath. So the comma after smell is just wrong. There's no... I'm surprised that I even noticed it. I was so distracted by the smell of semen. But anyway, so no, it wasn't so much the literary references as because I'm so out of watching movies and stuff, I did actually spend quite a bit of time Googling the movies. A lot of them, most of them were foreign movies, not American movies or not British movies. And that was interesting for me.
Yeah, there's a lot of like European art film going on in this one for sure.
So are you doing any other Pride reading this month?
Yes, I am actually. I just started last night this book called Let the Record Show by Sarah Schulman. It just came out, I believe, in May. It's a history of ACT UP New York from 1987 to, I think, 1993. And I've started reading a lot more nonfiction in the past year. AIDS activism and just sort of the specific history of the AIDS crisis in the United States and its unfolding. It's something I should definitely know more about. So yeah, I started that last night and was on the verge of tears multiple times throughout the introduction. So, you know, it's a long road ahead too. There's about, I think it's over 500 pages. Wow. It's pretty chunky text.
So Sarah Schulman and I go way back. I don't know her personally, but I saw her at several queer literary events, starting with the Gay Games in Vancouver in 1990. And then I saw her at, I've forgotten the names of them all, the different queer lit conferences, but I've seen her at least 3 times in face to face, and she's a warm, friendly person. I follow her on Facebook all these years later, and I have read, the only novel of hers I've read was her AIDS novel, her AIDS activism novel, People in Trouble. Do you know it?
No, this is the first.
Okay.
This is my total introduction to her as a writer, for sure.
I remember not really loving the novel, but I would love to read more recent stuff by her. And I've also read her 1995 novel, Rat Bohemia. I didn't like it, but her ones from the 80s, Girls, Visions, and Everything, 1986, and After Dolores, 1988. I've heard good things about those, so I'd like to read those. And I'm very interested in this history that she has written.
Yeah, one of the interesting things to me about it so far is that if I'm remembering correctly, some of the interviews used in this book as sort of part of the evidence, or to help build the narrative of what's going on at this particular period, were interviews conducted for a documentary that she helped to make with a gentleman whose name is escaping me. But it's called United in Anger, and it is available. The book itself tells you this is available to watch for free on YouTube. So I started watching that last night as well. And it's quite an emotional experience so far. But I think it seems like if you're curious enough to consider reading this like longer history by Schulman, that watching that movie, which I believe is about an hour and a half, maybe might be a good way to decide if you want to, dive deeper in the text format or not.
Her penultimate work of nonfiction from 2016, I've heard a lot of interesting things about, including the fact that Hillary Clinton loved it, which, maybe I shouldn't have mentioned her name, but I did. And that is, it's controversial, but in a way that interests me. The title is Conflict is Not Abuse. And the subtitle, Overstating Harm, Community Responsibility, and the Duty of Repair. And so it's kind of taking on this new millennial thing, and not wanting to say anything disparaging or disrespectful about that, but the things you hear about on campus where people just want to cancel everything or whatever, she's taking it on in a way that she, as a very left wing, she's got all of her street cred for activism and stuff, and let me just read the title again. Conflict is Not Abuse, Overstating Harm, Community Responsibility, and the Duty of Repair. I've been so curious about it since I heard about it. So,
that does sound really interesting.
Yes.
and topically relevant to
that's right.
Online discourse.
Because she has the credibility with all of her activism, but she's of a certain generation. But yeah, I'd like to know more about that. So Dan, shall we do these chats weekly or bi-monthly?
I'd love to. I'm game.
You're what?
I'm game. Wink.
When is Pride Day where you live? When do you have your Pride celebration?
That's a good question.
Every day is Pride Day.
There you go. I live life to the fullest and gayest each day. I'm not sure, and I can't say I really have any plans to go out into a public event.
I haven't been interested in any of that stuff for years.
Have you been to a Tokyo Pride before? I was curious about that.
No interest. No. So I just read gay books. That's how I celebrate. So thank you very much, Dan. Let's do this again real soon. Next time you get to choose.
Oh, all right. That's an incentive if I've ever heard one.